Dragon's Dogma 2 is a game that is very similar to D&D in many ways. So when I first decided I might try to convert some things from Dragon's Dogma 2 into D&D, I thought that this would probably be a helpful thing, that there would be a lot of overlap for things I could move over. However, I quickly came to realize that the fact that they share so much in common means there's not much I need to move over. You can basically do most of the things in Dragon's Dogma 2 that you do in D&D. However, there were some things that caught my eye when looking through the game. Some things that I thought, that could come in handy as a D&D mechanic. So this video is going to be somewhat of a smorgasbord, swag bag, sort of eclectic mix of things from Dragon's Dogma 2 into D&D. So the first thing that I tried to adapt to D&D from Dragon's Dogma 2 was being able to climb on large monsters. This is something that you are capable in doing in not very many video games, Monster Hunter being the only other game I can think of other than Dragon's Dogma 2 that lets you do this. And while there aren't any D&D rules for climbing on monsters, there are rules for climbing, and you could just ask your DM to climb on a monster and he would probably say yes with the addendum of some ability check. However, I figured that the climbing on monsters from Dragon's Dogma 2 could actually function well as a feat to allow you as a player to climb monsters better in D&D with actual rules. So I made the Monster Climber feat for D&D that will allow players to climb on larger monsters. Specifically looking at the feat, they can only climb on monsters if they are more than one size larger than them. And that's to specify that I want the monster to be of a significant size larger than you. I didn't really think small creatures climbing on medium creatures or medium climbing on large would be very good for the immersion or fantasy of it. If a small creature climbs on a medium creature, that's basically just a piggyback ride at that point. So when making this feature, one thing I had to consider was, one, feats sometimes have to be fairly good in order to draw players' attention away from some of the more popular feats and ability score improvements. But also I wanted to make sure that this feat would give you more than the DM would give you if you just asked to climb a monster, because we want the feat to improve upon something you might already be able to do. In my mind, a DM would likely ask for an ability check like acrobatics or athletics, and at best you're probably climbing a monster at half of your walking speed. So the Monster Climber feat allows you to climb monsters at a speed equal to your walking speed, which is fairly fast, and makes you much better at climbing monsters than the rest of your party members. And then additionally to that, if you do have a climbing speed already, that speed is doubled when you climb a monster. Again, just to make sure that the feat is better than what you would normally be able to do. And then some of the actual benefits that the feat grants you for climbing on monsters is that you have advantage on attack rolls against that monster you're climbing on, but you also reduce the number you need to roll a crit by 1. So there is some serious benefit to climbing on a monster if you take this feat. And of course, we want that to be the case because, for one, feats sometimes need to be pretty good to get picked, but also, two, it's quite a dangerous proposition to climb on a monster anyways, especially with spells that could hit you as well as the monster. So we wanted to make sure that the trade-off is worthwhile. So the next thing that I converted from Dragon's Dogma 2 was an item, specifically a ring, the Ring of Proximity from Dragon's Dogma. This ring intrigued me because the ring allows you to have stronger bow attacks when you're close to your enemies, and that struck me as something that I don't really see very often in D&D, and is kind of interesting because ranged characters tend to sort of sit far behind their allies and just plink away from afar in D&D. So if you did want to push a ranged player to push up and be more aggressive with the rest of the party, you could give them a ring that grants them bonuses for being close to their enemy with a ranged weapon. So that's what this Ring of Proximity does. It's rare and requires attunement, and the ring, when you are within 15 feet of a creature and targeting it with a ranged weapon attack, you get to reroll any damage dice that result in a 1. But this benefit also gets stronger as you get closer. So within 10 feet of the enemy, you get to reroll 1s and 2s on the damage dice, and within 5 feet, you get to reroll 1s, 2s, and 3s. And this is just going to overall increase your average damage as you start to close the gap and get close to the enemy. And it's definitely going to increase the average because when you do these rerolls, although you can only reroll each die once, you get to take whichever result you want. So if the first roll was higher, you can take that. So just a cool idea for a ring in D&D that I hadn't really thought of before, but makes total sense as something you might give to a player to either compensate for the fact that you're in maybe lots of small dungeons a lot and it is cramped, or just to give the player incentive to close that gap with the rest of the party. So I did convert another item here, and this item is a bit different than the Ring of Proximity because this item is actually one of the main items for a vocation. I converted the Trickster's Censer weapon that they use in Dragon's Dogma 2 into a magic item for D&D. Now, when I first originally saw the Trickster vocation in Dragon's Dogma, it reminded me a lot of Echo Knight from D&D, as well as Invoke Duplicity from Cleric. So I decided to sort of emulate that route and look at those abilities to sort of make a magic item that is both a reference to Dragon's Dogma 2, but also incorporates some of the aspects from those classes. So the Trickster's Censer is a legendary item that requires attunement, and once per long rest, you get to make a duplicate of yourself that's made of like a magical smoke. It has a scaling hit point amount and AC amount, immunity to all conditions, and very average ability scores. It moves around the same way that Invoke Duplicity moves around from Cleric. Notably, what the duplicate can actually do, or its function, is very similar to the Trickster Censer in Dragon's Dogma 2. When hostile creatures start their turn within 30 feet of the duplicate, they need to make a wisdom save, and if they fail, they have disadvantage on attacks against anything other than your duplicate for that turn. So the duplicate is capable of drawing aggro the same way the Trickster can. The duplicate lasts for an hour or until destroyed or dismissed, but notably, if the duplicate is destroyed or dismissed early, it explodes into the 4th level confusion spell centered on itself as though you had cast it. So there's multiple ways you could use this Trickster Censer and get multiple purposes out of it. You could just use it as a aggro drawing device to sort of pull aggression of your enemies away, but you could also intentionally try to send it into the mix and get the enemies to clump around it, and then when it's destroyed or you dismiss it, it can explode and get a 4th level spell out of its, utility. Overall, a cool item, and it's both a nod to Dragon's Dogma 2, but also very similar to other things in D&D, which makes it really seat into a D&D campaign very well without your players knowing where you're getting this from. So the next thing that I converted from Dragon's Dogma 2 was not an item, but in fact a spell. I took a look through the Mage and Sorcerer and all the spells that I could find in Dragon's Dogma 2, and none of them really compelled me. Nothing was really all that different than the things we have in D&D. However, the Prescient Flare spell did stand out to me. That spell in Dragon's Dogma allows you to attach some sort of like a effect or sensor or orb to an enemy, and after a certain amount of time that will explode and deal damage, but the benefit of it is that if the enemy is struck, it explodes early. So you can deliver damage much quicker if you have somebody striking that enemy while you're casting the spell. So I thought that was a cool idea to modify and fit into D&D, and I modified it a bit to fit more of the teamwork of D&D. So Prescient Flare is a 3rd level spell. When you cast it, you pick an enemy and they have to make a con save, and if they fail, the orb is affixed to them. While the orb is affixed to them, each time the creature takes damage, the orb grows in power. At the start of your next turn, the orb explodes in a 5-foot radius centered on the target creature, dealing 2d8 force damage, plus an additional 1d8 force damage for each instance of damage it took while the orb was affixed. So that end part being the key here. So you cast this spell, and if it affixes to the enemy, you only get 2d8 damage out of it when it explodes at the start of your next turn. However, if your allies are able to hit this creature, then it can take a bunch more damage from the spell. For example, if you cast this on an enemy and you have 3 allies and they all make 2 attacks in a turn, that's 6 attacks potentially at that target, meaning 6 more d8s onto the damage when the spell goes off. So this is a very teamwork-oriented damage spell, which I don't really see a lot in D&D. It's not a great spell if it's just you versus one other creature, and it's also not a great spell if you're using it against weak creatures. You want a strong, high hit point creature that all of your allies are going to be attacking as well. That's where this spell would shine in a damage scenario. So there is one last thing that I converted from Dragon's Dogma 2 into D&D here, and this one is a pretty unique thing that I haven't really tried before. I'm calling this a plug and play feature. Now what this is it's a monster feature that I would normally stick into a monster stat block, and it would be one of the features that that monster has. However, instead I've broken it out here into a plug and play feature, and I've left a lot of blanks for you, the DM, to fill in on it so that you can customize the feature to whatever monster it is and the encounter. So let's read through it so you get a better idea of what I'm talking about. The feature is called Weak Point. The monster, that being whatever the name of the monster is that you're using this on, has X number of weak points across its body. So that's for you to determine how many weak points it has. A creature targeting the monster with an attack may choose to make a targeted attack against one of these weak points before rolling the attack. Targeting a weak point gives the monster a plus, however much you want, bonus to its armor class against the attack. If the attack hits, it bypasses any of the monster's damage resistances. All damage dice rolls have advantage, and any damage dealt this way also reduces the monster's HP maximum by the same amount as the damage dealt. Once damage has been dealt to a weak point this way, the weak point is destroyed and may no longer be targeted. So the idea being here, if you couldn't already tell, it's to represent the weak points in Dragon's Dogma 2. A lot of the larger creatures like the golems, the dragons, and that big guy that walks out of the water, I forget his name, these all have these weak points that in Dragon's Dogma 2 you're intended to climb along the monster and target those, though you don't have to, you can just target them. It's sort of a damage mechanic from the game. And I thought that's a neat idea for D&D. Spots on a monster that you can target that are a bit harder to hit, but if struck will give you benefits to allow you to sort of bypass its defenses. Now, one of the notable things in here that I want to mention is that it says it bypasses any of the monster's damage resistances if you strike one of these weak points. Feel free to modify that to whatever thing your monster has that is oppressive to players doing damage, right? So maybe it's a damage vulnerability that this could bypass, or a resistance, or maybe there's some special feature it has that negates certain weapon types or magic weapons or something like that. Whatever you want, just as long as it allows the players to get some bypass of the monster's defenses. That's the idea. And also note as part of this that I haven't specified how many weak points the monster has. And again, that's for you to decide because these weak points are strong, right, for the players. If the players target these, they're going to be able to do lots of damage to your monster if they hit it. And there's a good chance that inevitably they'll hit one. Now, these weak points get used up. It says in the ability that they go away once they've been damaged. So it's up for you to decide how many times you want players to be able to take benefit from these weak points. So that's why that's left blank among the other things like the bonus it gives to armor class, which is purely for balance. And so this is something that it's a plug and play feature, I'm calling it. You could plug it into a stat block if you were making one or had one. You could just drop this in that stat block and use it, or you could just keep it separately on a dock somewhere as a mechanic that you're using for certain monsters. You just have this on standby and you can reference it as a mechanic for certain boss monsters that you want to use it for. And the last thing I'll mention with this is this does probably synergize pretty well with introducing the monster climber feature into your game. I actually think that this could be a scenario where if you introduce this weak point feature on a boss, perhaps if you placed a weak point that was somewhere on the boss that the players couldn't reach unless they climbed the monster, then you could in some ways try to encourage a player to attempt to climb that monster to hit these weak points, like in Dragon's Dogma 2, and perhaps they gain the Monster Climber feature just for successfully doing so. Maybe the Monster Climber feature is something you introduce in the game as a reward for attempting to do what Monster Climber is all about. So something just as food for thought of how you could introduce both of these things at once to your players very seamlessly into your game. So those were all the things that I converted from Dragon's Dogma 2 into D&D for this video. This was a bit of a different type of video, so let me know what you guys think of this format. Just kind of converting whatever I think is interesting rather than specifically stat blocks or specifically spells or anything else from the game. And more than that, let me know if there are other games you think I should do this type of thing to. Any games that you think have a variety of things that could be brought to D&D. But anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.